So this is Luke chapter 22, the scripture for May 13th. In the first half of this chapter, there's several mentions of Passover, or the festival of unleavened bread. You can find the history for these holidays in the book of Exodus, in fact, chapters 12 and 13. They recall how God spared every household from death, which had sacrificed a lamb and painted its blood on their doorframe. By referring to Passover, Luke seems to suggest that Jesus is in fact taking on the role of being the Passover lamb for the entire world, and that his death will redeem the world from death. One of the things God says in Exodus is that the Pharaoh had taken God's firstborn son Israel, and so God is going to take Pharaoh's firstborn son. In the same way, the world has taken God's firstborn of creation, God's image bearers and human beings, and so God is trading his firstborn son for us. Luke also illustrates what wrong motives do to someone's actions. The religious leaders were afraid the people would turn away from them. Peter and the other disciples wanted to have the power of greatness, but in both of these cases, the motives lead to destruction. They lead to traitorous actions. Instead of seeking authority, in other words, Christians are called to focus on service, just as Jesus models. Instead of trying to hang on to power as the religious leaders do, which lead to their betrayal of the Son of God, and instead of insisting, hey, I'm fit for greatness in the kingdom of heaven, which ultimately leads to these disciples denying Christ, we're called to serve. That's what Jesus did. That's what we're called to do as well. Before they leave for the Mount of Olives, Jesus commands his disciples. It's an interesting command. He says, sell your cloaks and buy swords. And the disciples produce 2 swords, and Jesus says it's enough. Why? Why would Jesus want his disciples to have swords? Didn't Jesus come to bring peace? Well, Jesus says why. He says so that he will be counted among the lawless. This is toward a quote from Isaiah 53, verse 12, I believe, toward the end of that chapter, that he'd be counted among the transgressors. And this is ultimately the reason he asks his disciples to carry swords, so they'll be seen as bandits. Some American Christians have tried to use this passage to justify gun ownership and gun use. And actually, this specific passage, it doesn't really work that way. It's not a command for Christians for all time. It's really a command that's couched in a specific context for a specific time. Indeed, as the disciples began to use the swords when Jesus was being arrested, you can see this in verse 50, Jesus stops them. Clearly, Jesus did not have in mind Christians with full gun lockers, ready to take on the world. This is not the direction of this command. Luke pays careful attention to detail. That's one of the practices he has as a doctor. And in fact, the phenomenon that he describes when Jesus sweats drops of blood actually has medical data behind it. I've attached a link in the description below. You can read more about it there. But people doubted this depiction of Jesus suffering for some time because they didn't think that there was actual medical data behind this. Now finally, Peter's Galilean accent was enough to make him stand out in the courtyard. There are some scholars who think actually that Galileans were sort of the Mexican Americans of their time. They were a combination of cultures that weren't really welcomed by either culture, either Gentiles nor Jews. They were seen as backwards and unsophisticated to the Jews. Perhaps that's one of the reasons the religious leaders rejected Jesus, because of his Galilean pedigree. When the religious leaders accuse Jesus, be careful. Don't miss his I am statement here. Most of the I am statements come from the Gospel of John, which we'll see later on in the year, but Luke sneaks one in here. When Jesus says, you say that I am, there's a double meaning. I am, of course, is the name of Israel's God, Yahweh. And Jesus suggests that by their treatment of him, the religious leaders are in fact acknowledging his identity as I am. I wonder, how can you allow Jesus to redeem you from death today? That's all for Luke chapter 22. Tomorrow, the 14th of May, we'll be looking at Luke chapter 23. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.